The Apollo missions were a lie. Not because we didn't go to the moon, but because of why we never went back. In 1959, 3 men died in a place that shouldn't exist, screaming into radios that were supposedly turned off, staring at a Nazi insignia etched into the lunar dust 15 years before NASA was even born. You think the space race was about prestige? It was a frantic, terrifying scramble to board a sinking ship before the owners came back to claim it. Welcome to the shadows of the lunar far side. Welcome to Project Iron Vein. The file was marked Ethelgard 0. It sat in a lead-line vault beneath the Pentagon for 70 years, shielded from the eyes of every president except the ones who were told they weren't truly in charge. It contains a single photograph taken by a high-altitude reconnaissance balloon in 1956. The image doesn't show craters or basalt plains. It shows a geometric shadow in the Aitken Basin, a shadow that moves against the rotation sun. When Colonel Elias Thorne first saw that photograph, he didn't see an alien invasion. He saw a logistical nightmare. The shadow was artificial, colossal, and pulsing with a localized magnetic field that was knocking Eisenhower's secret spy satellites out of orbit. But the real Aqaba, the great wonder, wasn't the shadow itself. It was a faint, rhythmic signal being broadcast from that shadow. It wasn't a message for Earth. It was an interrogation. By 1958, the Americans and the Soviets did something unthinkable. They stopped pointing nuclear missiles at each other for long enough to point a joint expedition at the moon. They built the Vostok Alpha, a Frankenstein's monster of a spacecraft, powered by a prototype nuclear thermal engine that leaked enough radiation to kill the crew 10 times over before they even left the atmosphere. The crew knew this. They went anyway, because the alternative, letting whatever was on the moon finish its interrogation, was worse. Commander Jack Miller, the man leading the mission, was a ghost. He had officially died in a training accident in 1954. Beside him was Dr. Elias Thorne, a linguist who specialized in dead languages, and Major Alexei Volkov, a KGB liquidator whose job was to ensure that they found something too dangerous to bring back. No one would leave the lunar surface alive. As the Vostok Alpha swung around the dark side of the moon, the Aqaba effect hit them like a physical wall. The stars didn't just disappear. They were blotted out by a structure so vast it distorted the very perception of distance. It was a spire of black, non-reflective glass, miles high, anchored into the lunar crust by glowing blue conduits, the iron veins. They landed. The mystery of the shadow was solved. It was a massive solar harvesting array of unknown origin. But as Miller stepped onto the surface, the first resolution sparked a much more terrifying question. In the beam of his flashlight, resting in the pristine, undisturbed lunar dust, was a discarded cigarette pack. Lucky's, the brand American GIs smoked in the trenches of France. Next to it, a boot print, but it wasn't a space boot. It was a hobnail combat boot. "Colonel, we have a breach," Miller whispered, his voice trembling. Someone was here, and they didn't use a rocket. They followed the tracks toward the base of the Great Spire. The blue light from the iron veins hummed with a frequency that made their teeth ache. The deeper they went into the obsidian labyrinth, the more the history of the world began to unravel. They found a chamber, a massive vault-to-hall cold metal, where the walls were lined with glass canisters. Inside weren't aliens. They were humans, men and women in 1940 civilian clothing, frozen in a state of suspended animation, their eyes open, their retinas glowing with that same sickly blue light. But the most haunting discovery was at the center of the hall, a radio console, primitive by 1958 standards, but clearly modified with components that defied physics. It was broadcasting. The signal that had started the space race was being sent by a dead man. A German officer sat slumped in the chair, his hand fused to the transmitter. He's not broadcasting a signal, Dr. Thorne realized, leaning over the mummified remains. He's receiving one from Earth. The Aqaba shifted. If the signal was coming from Earth, who was sending it? And why were they using the moon as a relay station to harvest human beings? Just as Volkov reached for the console, the iron veins turned from blue to a violent, pulsing red. The garrison wasn't a base. It was a slaughterhouse. And the lights had just turned on for the next shift. From the ceiling, the shifting geometry of the spire began to descend. Not robots, not creatures, but the harvesters, beings made of liquid shadow and jagged light. Miller raised his weapon, but he realized his hand was beginning to glow. The iron vein wasn't just on the floor. It was now under his skin. The sapphire glow beneath Miller's skin wasn't just light. It was a pulse. It mirrored the rhythmic thrumming of the great spire itself, a cold, alien heartbeat that seemed to be rewriting his nervous system in real time. He stared at his arm, watching the luminous blue filaments trace the path of his veins up toward his chest. He felt no pain, only a terrifying sense of belonging. "Don't move, Commander." Major Volkov's voice came through the comms, stripped of all human warmth. He had his Makarov aimed squarely at Miller's visor. "The protocol for biological contamination is absolute. You are no longer an American pilot. You are a breach. Lower the gun, Alexei." Dr. Thorne stepped between them, his eyes darting from the glowing pilot to the rows of glass canisters. "Look at the canisters. They aren't just specimens. They're reacting." The hissing of the draining coolant grew into a deafening roar. The liquid nitrogen turned to a thick, white fog that swirled around their boots. Within the canisters, the 1940s passengers, the men in wool suits and the women in Sunday dresses, began to twitch. Their movements were jagged, defying the natural range of human motion. As the glass doors slid open with a synchronized hiss, the corpses didn't fall. They stepped out. Their eyes were gone, replaced by the same sapphire luminescence that was currently colonizing Miller's blood. "They're not alive," Thorne whispered, backing away as a man in a tattered trench coat tilted his head at an impossible angle. "They're nodes. The spire is using their neural pathways as a makeshift antenna." Suddenly, the mummified German officer at the central console began to speak. The sound didn't come from his vocal cords. It was a multi-layered electronic resonance that vibrated directly inside their helmets. "The relay is complete. The seeds are gathered. The great filter begins." Before Volkov could pull the trigger on Miller, the floor beneath them shuddered. The obsidian walls of the chamber didn't just move. They folded like paper, reconfiguring the entire geometry of the spire. The exit they'd used to enter was swallowed by a sliding slab of black glass. They weren't in a hallway anymore. They were on a descending platform, dropping rapidly into the lunar crust. As they descended, the mystery resolution loop tightened. The resolution came first. They saw the true scale of the iron veins. Deeper than any human drill had ever reached, the blue conduits converged into a massive, rotating sphere of pure gravity. This wasn't a base. It was a gravitational engine. The moon wasn't a satellite. It was a vessel. But the new mystery followed immediately, more terrifying than the first. Surrounding the engine were holographic projections of Earth. They weren't maps of the Cold War. They were tactical overlays showing every nuclear silo in the United States and the Soviet Union. Red dots began to blink in rapid succession across the globe. "Why is a lunar engine tracking our missile silos?" Volkov demanded, his mission as a KGB officer momentarily overriding his fear. Thorne lunged for a secondary terminal, his fingers flying over the smooth, haptic interface. "It's not tracking them, Alexei. It's triggering them." The realization hit them like a physical blow. The signal that had started the space race wasn't a call for exploration. It was a digital virus designed to infiltrate the primitive early warning systems of the 1950s. The Spire was forcing a premature nuclear exchange on Earth. But why? Miller gasped, his glowing hand now vibrating in sync with the gravity sphere below. "If they want the planet, why burn it?" "Because they don't want the planet," Thorne said, his voice trembling as he translated the scrolling alien glyphs. "They want the harvest. A planet in the middle of a nuclear winter produces a specific type of biological distress. They are culling the species, Miller, taking the elite genetic data, like those people in the canisters, and leaving the rest to burn so the filter can restart the cycle." The spire groaned, a sound of grinding tectonic plates. The launch sequence had reached its final phase. The Aitken Basin was cracking open, and the black glass towers were preparing to pierce the lunar atmosphere. "We have to stop the transmission," Miller said, his voice dropping into a hard, tactical tone. "If we can't save the moon, we save the Earth. We kill the engine." "We can't." Thorne pointed to the gravity sphere. "It's shielded by a localized time dilation field. If we step inside, we'll age 1,000 years in a second. Only someone who matches the frequency can enter." Thorne looked at Miller's glowing arm. The blue light had reached his neck now, tracing a glowing crown around his jaw. Miller was no longer just a pilot. He was the key. He was the only one who could pass through the shield and sabotage the heart of the Spire. But as Miller stepped toward the engine, the harvesters appeared. They didn't emerge from doors. They materialized from the shadows themselves, beings of shifting, non-Euclidean geometry. They ignored Thorne and Volkov. They formed a ring around Miller, their jagged limbs vibrating with a sound that mimicked a choir of screaming metal. "They're not stopping you, Miller," Thorne realized in horror. "They're waiting for you. They've been waiting for a human pilot to interface with the engine. The Spire doesn't have a captain. It needs a biological CPU to calculate the jump. If Miller entered the engine, he could save the Earth from the nuclear launch, but he would become the permanent pilot of a ghost ship, drifting into the deep void with a cargo of frozen corpses. If he stayed, the world would burn in a matter of minutes. "Miller, don't do it," Volkov yelled, but he wasn't looking at Miller. He was looking at the holographic Earth. The first red dot on the map had just turned white. A launch had been detected in North Dakota. Miller looked at his hand, then at the shifting shadows of the harvesters. He felt the countdown in his brain. Tell them we didn't go to the moon for peace," Miller whispered. He stepped into the gravity sphere. The world didn't explode. It went silent. The blue light intensified until it blinded them, and for a split second, Thorne and Volkov saw something that shouldn't be possible. The moon's far side didn't move away from the Earth. It unfolded. When the light faded, Miller was gone. The harvesters were gone. The engine was silent. But as Thorne looked at the holographic display, the red dots were still there. The nuclear launch hadn't been stopped. It had been redirected. "Where are the missiles going, Thorne?" Volkov asked, his voice shaking. Thorne looked at the coordinates. They weren't hitting Washington or Moscow. They were all converging on a single, uninhabited coordinate in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. "The engine didn't stop the war," Thorne whispered. "Miller used the Spire to fire at something under the water, something that was waiting for the filter to finish." As the moon began to vibrate with new, much more aggressive power, a massive shadow began to rise from the Pacific holographic map, something larger than a continent. The silence following Miller's disappearance into the gravity sphere was more deafening than the roar of the engines. Thorne and Volkov stood on the precipice of the abyss, staring at the empty space where their commander had been consumed by sapphire light. The Spire was no longer groaning. It was singing, a high-pitched, harmonic frequency that made the very air inside their suits feel like it was composed of needles. On the holographic display, the redirected nuclear missiles were seconds away from impact. The Pacific Ocean, usually a vast blue void on the map, was now teeming with thermal data. A gargantuan mass was ascending from the Mariana Trench, a silhouette so immense it made the tectonic plates of the surrounding continents buckle. "What did he wake up, Thorne?" Volkov demanded, his hands trembling as he checked his oxygen levels. "The missiles, they aren't for the Spire. They are for that." "The Spire didn't come here to harvest us, Alexei," Thorne whispered, his eyes fixed on the rising mass. "It came here to suppress what was already here. We thought the moon was the intruder. We were wrong. The moon is the lid on the casket, and Miller just cracked it open." The resolution came with a blinding flash of white on the holographic map. The nuclear warheads detonated in a synchronized ring in the deep Pacific. The sensors on the lunar terminal shrieked as they recorded the displacement of billions of tons of water. For a moment, it looked like the threat had been neutralized, vaporized by the fury of man's most terrible weapons. But then, the mystery deepened into a nightmare. The white flashes didn't fade into the black of the ocean. They were absorbed. The thermal signatures of the nuclear blast were being drawn into the rising mass, feeding it, fueling its ascent. It wasn't a biological creature. It was an ancient planetary-scale machine that thrived on radiation. "It's an echo station," Thorne realized, his mind reeling from the data dump the Spire had forced into his brain. Built by the same hands that built the Spire, but corrupted. It's been waiting in the deep pressure of the ocean for a surge of energy to restart its heart. Miller didn't attack it. He accidentally gave it the jumpstart it needed. Suddenly, the Spire's interior changed again. The obsidian walls turned translucent, revealing the lunar landscape outside. The Aitken Basin was gone. The Spire was now floating in a pocket of distorted space-time, hovering miles above the lunar surface. Below them, they could see the moon itself beginning to crack. The blue iron veins were no longer pumping fluid down into the moon. They were pulling something out. Massive, crystalline pillars were erupting from the lunar craters, reaching toward the Spire like the fingers of a drowning man. "Thorne, look at the radio," Volkov shouted. The mummified German officer was no longer slumped. He was standing, his withered flesh stretching over his bones, as if something was inflating him from within. He pointed a bony finger at the translucent wall, toward the Earth. The siblings must reunite. The officer's voice boomed, now clear and devoid of distortion. The Earth Station and the Moon Station. The great filter cannot be stopped by a single pilot. The harvest is not of the body, but the soul's resonance. As he spoke, a beam of concentrated sapphire light erupted from the base of the Spire, land straight and impossibly bright, aimed directly at the Pacific coordinates. It wasn't a weapon. It was a bridge. "Miller," Thorne screamed into his comms. "If you can hear me, break the connection. You're pulling the moon into the Earth." A voice crackled over the radio. It was Miller, but it sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well, layered with 1,000 years of static. I can't stop it, Thorne. I'm not the pilot. I'm the battery. They are using my consciousness to calculate the atmospheric entry. I can see the stars, but they are moving too fast. They are screaming. The Aqaba effect shifted to a terrifying reality. The Spire was dragging the moon out of its orbit. The gravitational pull was already causing massive tsunamis on Earth, visible even from their vantage point. But there was a new, darker development. In the corridors behind them, the 1940s passengers, the nodes, were no longer wandering aimlessly. They were converging on the engine room. They were carrying pieces of the obsidian walls, fusing them to their own bodies, turning themselves into living armor. They weren't protecting the Spire. They were preparing for an invasion. They aren't going to the moon's surface, Volkov realized, drawing a combat knife as his gun was empty. They are going to Earth, through the bridge. One of the nodes, a woman in a blue summer dress, her face a mask of shifting black glass, stopped at the entrance of the chamber. She didn't attack. She held out a small, metallic object. It was Miller's dog tags. They were dripping with that same dark, viscous fluid they had seen in the engine room. "He is already gone," the node whispered in Miller's own voice. "The pilot has been integrated. Now, the crew must follow." Thorne looked at the dog tags, then at the sapphire bridge connecting the moon to the boiling Pacific. He realized the terrifying Aqaba of their situation. Miller hadn't just opened a casket. He had invited the funeral directors to the wake. "The missiles didn't just fail," Thorne said, his voice a hollow shell. "They were a signal, a dinner bell, and now, the things under the ocean are reaching back." From the sapphire beam, something began to climb up toward the moon. The bridge of light connecting the Aitken Basin to the Pacific Ocean was not a static beam. It was a swirling vortex of ionized lunar dust and hypercompressed gravity. Inside the Spire, the laws of physics were beginning to dissolve like sugar in acid. Thorne and Volkov stood paralyzed as a sapphire lance of energy pulsed with the rhythm of a dying star. This was no longer a mission of exploration or even sabotage. It was a witness to a planetary-scale assassination. "The dog tags," Volkov choked out, his eyes fixed on the metallic slivers held by the glass-faced woman in the summer dress. "If those are here, then what is sitting in the pilot seat? What is controlling the descent?" The node didn't answer with words. Instead, her chest cavity split open, revealing a ribcage made of vibrating obsidian tuning forks. Each fork hummed at a frequency that resonated with the sapphire bridge. Outside the translucent walls, the Earth was no longer a distant blue marble. It was a looming, terrifying wall of clouds and fire. The moon's exit from its stable orbit was causing the lunar atmosphere, a thin, artificial envelope maintained by the Spire, to ignite into a halo of friction-borne plasma. "Miller isn't the pilot anymore, Alexei," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking as the data dump in his brain began to categorize the nightmare. "He's the transducer. His human fear, his adrenaline, his very soul is being processed into a navigational language. They needed a biological heart to feel the Earth's gravity so they could spear the Pacific with surgical precision. They are using his instinct for survival to kill his home." Thorne lunged toward the central console, stepping over the twitching remains of the mummified German officer. He needed to find a backdoor, a flaw in the alien logic. As his fingers brushed the haptic glass, the Spire's history flooded his vision. He didn't see numbers. He saw memories that weren't his. He saw the moon as it was 3 billion years ago. Not a rock, but a gargantuan construction project. A silent sentinel placed by a civilization that had seen the swarm coming from the edge of the galaxy. The moon was a trap, a cage, and the thing rising from the Pacific? It wasn't an alien invader. It was the Warden, the anchor for the entire system. The resolution to the Pacific anomaly flashed across the holographic screens. The nuclear detonations hadn't just been absorbed. They had been used to illuminate the Warden's true form. As the steam cleared from the Mariana Trench, the sensors revealed a structure that mirrored the Spire perfectly. It was submerged sister station, an inverted pyramid of the same black glass, miles wide, anchored into the Earth's mantle. "The siblings are reuniting," Thorne gasped, his eyes widening as he watched the two gargantuan structures align. The Spire on the moon is the positive pole. The station in the Pacific is the negative. When they touch, when the sapphire bridge stabilizes, they will create a circuit that will drain the Earth's core to fuel the moon's departure. The world won't explode. It will simply go cold. A hollow, frozen husk left in the dark. The dread hit them with a new, visceral edge. The moon wasn't just leaving. It was taking the Earth's lifeblood as fuel to escape the coming swarm. But as Thorne watched the connection stabilize, he noticed a glitch, a flickering red light on the Spire's internal map. Someone was cutting through the conduits from the inside. "Alexei, look. Someone is sabotaging the iron veins from below. We aren't alone in the maintenance shafts." Volkov grabbed a discarded industrial torch from the Germans' era, the heavy metal cold in his hands. "The survivors? From the 1944 mission?" "No," Thorne said, his voice trembling as he read the energy signatures. "The signatures are wrong. They're Russian. But not your Russians, Alexei. These signatures are from a time that hasn't happened yet. Their technology is decades ahead of anything we've stolen from the Germans." They raced through the shifting geometry of the Spire, their boots slipping on the black glass floors as the gravity fluctuated violently. As they reached the airlock leading to the vein sector, they saw the saboteurs. 3 figures in high-tech, white and gold pressurized suits were using plasma cutters to sever the blue conduits. These weren't the clunky lead-line suits of 1958. These were sleek, agile, and bore an emblem Thorne didn't recognize, a stylized eye with a clock face as a pupil. "Identify yourselves," Volkov screamed, raising his empty pistol in a desperate bluff. One of the figures turned. The visor was a polarized mirror, reflecting the carnage of the Spire. A voice, synthesized and unnervingly calm, echoed through the chamber. "We are the Kronos Guard. We are here to ensure the loop remains closed. Commander Miller must complete the transit. The Warden must be fed to save the future. The Warden is going to kill the planet." Thorne yelled, stepping forward. "The planet is already a graveyard in our time. Doctor," the figure replied, not stopping the cutting. "We are here to make sure the moon reaches the 21st century intact. If you stop the bridge now, the swarm arrives to an empty system, and the human seed is lost forever. The sacrifice of your 1950s era is the price for survival of the human race across the stars. Do not interfere with the inevitable." The choice was an impossible wait. If Thorne and Volkov helped the Kronos Guard, they would be complicit in the destruction of their own world in 1958 to save a future they would never see. If they stopped them, they might save their Earth, but doomed the entire human race to the swarm. Every second of hesitation brought the moon closer to the Pacific, the heat in the room rising as the spire dipped into the stratosphere. "Where is Miller?" Thorne demanded. The figure pointed toward the gravity sphere, which was now visible through a floor vent. Inside the sphere, Miller was no longer a man. He had been stretched, his physical form becoming a long, luminous thread of sapphire data that spiraled into the heart of the engine. He was being used as a biological processor to navigate the complex gravitational currents of the Earth's atmosphere. "He is the pilot of the Great Cycle," the guard said, "but he is resisting. He is trying to steer the moon into the sun to end the cycle. We are here to keep him on course of the Pacific." Suddenly, the spire took a massive hit, not from the atmosphere and not from the Warden. It was hit from outside, through the translucent walls. Thorne saw a fleet of ships. They weren't Soviet. They weren't American. They were ancient wooden-hulled ships, galleons and frigates, floating in a vacuum of the upper atmosphere, their sails made of shimmering energy that caught the solar wind. "The 18th century," Volkov whispered, his mind finally breaking. "Why are there pirate ships in the vacuum?" "Thorne, tell me I'm hallucinating." "They aren't pirates," Thorne said, the data in his head screaming. "They are the seeds from previous harvests. The spire doesn't just harvest one era. It collects the best of every century. And they've come to protect their new home. They don't want the moon to reach the Earth. They want it to stay in the void, where they're the masters of their own frozen kingdom." The wooden ships opened fire with cannons that launched balls of concentrated plasma. They weren't hitting the spire. They were hitting the Warden's bridge, trying to sever the link. They wanted the spire to stay in orbit, even if it meant the Earth burned below. The Vane sector became a three-way war zone. The Kronos Guard from the future, the Spectral Fleet from the past, and two terrified men from 1958 caught in the middle. "Miller!" Thorne screamed into the floor vent. "Miller, can you hear me? You have to choose. The future, the past, or us. Break the cycle, Jack." From the sapphire thread that was once Jack Miller, a single pulse of light erupted. The radio in Thorne's ear hissed with a message that wasn't for the guards or the fleet. It was a desperate, human whisper. "The iron veins, they aren't just for power, Thorne. They are for memory. If you cut the central vein, the spire forgets its mission. It forgets the Warden. It forgets the swarm. It becomes just a rock again. And what happens to us if the machine forgets?" Volkov asked, gripping the plasma cutter. "We become a new star," Miller's voice whispered. "A star that burns for a single second in the atmosphere. But in that second, the world is free to choose its own end, without the Warden, without the spire, and without the swarm. Cut the vein, Thorne. Give them back their future." Thorne looked at the central conduit, a massive, trunk-like vein of blue fire that powered the entire spire. If he cut it, the lifeboat would lose its mind. The lifeboat would become a drifting tomb, and the moon would fall without guidance. But the Earth would be spared the harvest. As he reached the plasma cutter, the Kronos Guard raised their weapons. The Spectral Fleet's plasma balls began to breach the spire's hull. The air began to whistle out into the thinning atmosphere, a cold, deathly wind. Thorne felt the heat of the Earth below and the chill of the void above. The countdown was in its final seconds. He pulled the trigger. The moment the plasma cutter's beam bit into the central iron vein, the universe seemed to turn inside out. There was no explosion, no fire, only a sudden, absolute drain of color and sound. The sapphire blue of the conduits turned a sickly, translucent gray, and the hum that had vibrated in Thorne's teeth for days vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. The spire groaned. It wasn't the sound of machinery failing. It was the sound of a god dying. As the memory of the spire dissolved, the lunar fortress lost its grip on reality. One moment, they were a miles-high needle of black glass piercing the stratosphere. The next, they were a tumbling mountain of debris. The sapphire bridge connecting the moon to the Pacific snapped like a frozen wire under extreme tension. The recoil sent a shockwave across the Earth's atmosphere that was visible from space. A ripple of distorted light that flattened clouds for thousands of miles and sent massive tsunamis racing toward every coastline. The uncertainty of their survival reached a fever pitch. Without the Spire's guidance, the moon didn't return to its peaceful orbit. It began to drift, lurching away from the Earth with a violent, erratic momentum, dragging the very atmosphere along with it in a gravitational wake that threatened to strip the planet's oxygen into the void. In the Vane sector, gravity died. Thorne and Volkov were thrown into the air as the floor beneath them began to disintegrate into obsidian dust. The Kronos Guard from the future simply vanished. Their forms flickered like a dying television signal before being erased from existence. By cutting the Vane, Thorne hadn't just stopped the machine. He had severed the timeline that produced the guards. They didn't die. They simply ceased to have ever existed. The spectral fleet, the wooden ships in the past, suffered a far more visceral fate. Without the Spire's localized gravity field to protect them, the Ancient would groaned and splintered under the sudden atmospheric pressure. The energy sails tore away like wet paper, and the galleons were sucked into the wake of the moon's departure, disappearing into the vacuum like tattered, screaming ghosts. Miller! Thorne screamed, his voice echoing in the dead air of the collapsing chamber. The connection is cut. The engine is cold. Get out of there. Through the floor vent, the gravity sphere was no longer a swirling vortex of power. It was a stagnant pool of gray fog. The sapphire thread that was once Jack Miller's consciousness began to condense, snapping back into a solid human shape. He felt the floor of the engine room, gasping for air that was rapidly escaping through cracks in the hull. "We have to get to the escape pods," Volkov yelled, grabbing Thorne's shoulder and pulling him toward the docking bay. "The Spire is breaking apart. If we stay, we're just more lunar dust in a dead tomb." They scrambled through the crumbling obsidian hallways. The architecture was no longer shifting. It was shattering. Shards of black glass as large as skyscrapers were falling away from the main spire, plummeting toward the earth below like dark, jagged meteors. These were the seeds of a different kind, a reign of alien technology that would change human history forever, provided anyone survived the impacts to find them. They found Miller at the base of the engine. He was alive, but his eyes were still glowing with faint, residual silver light that seemed to flicker with the dying embers of the Spire's memory. He looked at Thorne, but his gaze seemed to pierce through the metal of the ship, looking at something millions of years across the cosmic dark. "It forgot," Miller whispered, his voice a dry, hollow rasp. "The Spire, it doesn't know why it's here anymore. But the Warden in the Pacific, it has a very long memory, and it's not bound by the Spire's logic." As they dragged Miller toward the last remaining Soviet-American escape craft, the Vostok Alpha's landing module, they looked out through a massive breach in the hull. The Pacific Ocean was boiling. The inverted pyramid of the Warden wasn't sinking. It was expanding, its black glass surface reflecting the fire of the falling debris. Without the Spire to suppress it, the machine under the ocean was claiming the Earth as its own territory. "We didn't save it, did we?" Volkov asked, his face pale as he strapped into the pilot's seat and began the emergency launch sequence. "We gave it a chance to fight back," Thorne said, his hand shaking as he initiated the separation bolts. "We stopped the harvest. Now, the Earth has to fight its own war without being drained like a battery." The module blasted away from the crumbling spire just as the black glass tower entered the thickest part of the atmosphere. They watched as the spire turned into a streak of white-hot fire, a falling star that would eventually slam into the Australian outback with the force of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. But as the module began its own perilous descent, Miller grabbed Thorne's arm. His grip was inhumanly strong, his fingers cold as ice. "The swarm, Thorne. It's not coming in 60 years, Miller said, his voice overlapping with 1,000 other distorted whispers. The spire was the only thing keeping them away. The blue light was a no trespassing sign for the entire galaxy. It was a warning to every predator in the dark. Now that the light is out, they can see us. They can see our warmth. They can see our fear. High above them, in the blackness beyond the moon, the stars began to move, not like planets and not like satellites. They were shifting in clusters, forming a massive geometric grid that slowly began to blot out the light of the Milky Way. The swarm had sensed the death of the Sentinel. The module hit the atmosphere, and the world outside turned into a deafening roar of orange flames. "Where are we landing, Volkov?" Thorne shouted over the screeching of the heat shield. Volkov looked at the flickering, distorted radar. The coordinates are jumping. The Warden's magnetic field is dragging us in like a magnet. We're not landing in the desert. Thorne, we're landing in the Pacific, right on top of the Mariana Trench. The final weight of their situation hit them as the module plummeted toward the water. They weren't going home to a world of Cold War politics and secret files. They were landing in the heart of the enemy's territory, on a planet that was now a beacon for every hungry thing in the cosmos. As the module splashed down into the churning, dark waters of Pacific, the last thing Thorne saw through the porthole was a massive, glowing eye opening beneath the waves. It wasn't blue. It was a deep, hungry, and ancient red. The splashdown was not the cushion reprieve they had prayed for. When the Vostok Alpha landing module hit the Pacific, it didn't bob on the surface like a cork. The impact felt like hitting concrete at terminal velocity. The internal lights of the capsule flickered, turned a violent crimson, and then died, leaving Thorne, Volkov, and the shell of Jack Miller in a terrifying, pitch-black silence. Outside, the sound was even worse, a deep metallic groaning of the sea itself, as if the water were being crushed by an invisible hand. "Seal the vents," Volkov roared, his voice muffled by the blood in his mouth. He lunged for the manual overrides, his fingers fumbling in the dark. But as Thorne wiped the condensation and blood from the small porthole, he realized they weren't floating. The module was being dragged beneath the waves. The Warden's magnetic field, a force that had once anchored the moon, was now acting as a gravitational sink. They were sinking into the Mariana Trench at a rate that defied physics. "We're going down, Alexei," Thorne whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The Warden isn't letting us go. It's collecting the witnesses." As the pressure increased, the porthole glass began to scream. The depths of the Pacific were usually a graveyard of cold silence. But here, miles below the sunlight, the water was alive with sapphire and crimson luminescence. The debris from the shattered spire was falling with them, massive shards of black glass that glowed with residual heat, cutting through the water like obsidian knives. The deeper they fell, the more the world outside transformed. This wasn't the ocean floor known to 1950 science. It was a factory. The Warden, the inverted pyramid they'd seen on the lunar monitors, was now visible in its full, horrific majesty. It was a sprawling complex of black spires and glowing conduits that mirrored the iron veins of the moon. But where the moon's veins were blue, these were a pulsating, visceral red. "Look at the hull," Miller said, his voice no longer a whisper but a resonant hum that seemed to vibrate the very air inside the module. Thorne looked. Small, bioluminescent organisms, crustaceans and jellyfish that should have been mindless, were swarming the module. But they weren't just swimming, they were fusing. Their biological matter was being grafted onto the metal of the capsule, their nervous systems being used to bridge the gap between human technology and the Warden's interface. It's not just a machine, Thorne realized, the data in his mind finally clicking into a terrifying picture. The Warden is a biomechanical parasite. It doesn't just harvest resources, it harvests evolution. It's been down here for millions of years, taking every creature that fell into the trench and adding its DNA to the system. And now, it wants the data from the Spire. Suddenly, the module stopped with a bone-shattering jolt. They had landed on a platform of smooth, black glass, miles below the surface. Outside, the pressure should have crushed them instantly, but a localized field of dry, breathable air, smelling of ozone and ancient salt, suddenly filled the docking bay they had been dragged into. The hatch of the module hissed and blew outward, not from explosion, but because the Warden had commanded it to open. Volkov was the first one out. His Makarov held steady despite the fact that his suit was leaking oxygen. He stepped onto black glass floor, his boots echoing in a chamber so vast it had its own internal weather system. Clouds of gray vapor swirling around red glowing pillars. "Drop the weapon, Major," a voice echoed through the chamber. It wasn't a synthesized alien voice. It was human, clear, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. From behind one of the pillars stepped a man in a U.S. Navy uniform. But the insignia was wrong. It bore the mark of the Project Blue Book Elite, a branch that wasn't supposed to exist for another decade. Beside him stood a Soviet officer in a high-altitude pressure suit. They weren't fighting. They were standing together, side by side, like brothers. Colonel Thorne, the Navy officer, asked, looking at Elias, Thorne's brother, "We've been waiting for the lunar data. You're late. The swarm is already at the edge of the Kuiper Belt." "Who are you?" Thorne demanded, his mind reeling. "How are you down here? How are you breathing?" "We are the remnant," the officer said. His eyes glowed with that same faint, hungry red light. "The spire was a shield, yes, but the Warden is the vault. When the swarm arrives to scour the surface of the earth, only those within the Warden's embrace will survive. We made the deal in 1947, Doctor, after the Roswell crash. We didn't find a saucer in New Mexico. We found a map that led us here." The mystery of the Cold War suddenly collapsed into a singular, grim reality. The Americans and Soviets hadn't been racing to Moon to win a war. They had been racing to see who could provide the Warden with enough data to secure their place in the vault. The nuclear missiles Miller had redirected weren't an accident. They were a failed attempt by a rogue faction of the military to destroy the Warden before it could complete the selection. "The selection?" Volkov spat. "You mean the harvest. Evolution requires a filter major." The Soviet officer stepped forward. "The swarm is that filter. They're the cosmic locusts that eat entire civilizations. But the Warden saves the best parts, the strongest minds, the most resilient genes. You three are the first humans to return from the Spire with the lunar frequency. You are the keys to the next stage of human existence." The officer pointed toward the center of the chamber. A massive, crystalline sarcophagus was rising from the floor. Inside, Thorne could see the silhouettes of hundreds of people, scientists, soldiers, and world leaders, all linked together by red iron veins. They weren't dead, but they weren't human anymore. They were a collective consciousness, a biological supercomputer designed to wait out the coming apocalypse. "And what happens to the billions on the surface?" Thorne asked, his voice trembling with rage. "They are the chaff," the Navy officer said simply. "They will feed the swarm. Their heat and their panic will distract the predators, while the Warden sinks deeper into the mantle, hidden from the cosmic sensors. It's the only way for the species to endure." Suddenly, Jack Miller stepped forward. The silver light in his eyes flared, clashing with the red luminescence of the chamber. He didn't look at the officers. He looked at the sarcophagus. "The Spire is dead," Miller said, his voice carrying the weight of the vacuum. "I killed the memory. The Warden doesn't have the coordinates for the deep descent anymore. You're trapped here, just like us." The Navy officer's face contorted into a mask of pure, crystalline fury. "Then we take the coordinates from your brain. Commander, we have the technology to peel your mind like an orange." From the shadows of the chamber, the Warden's harvesters began to emerge. But these weren't the shifting geometries of the Moon. These were biological nightmares. Creatures made of deep-sea biomass, fused with black glass and cold steel. They move with a fluid, terrifying grace, their many-limbed forms clicking against the glass floor. "Alexei, the module," Thorne shouted. "It's dead, Thorne. We're at the bottom of the world." Volkov yelled, but he didn't give up. He lunged to the Navy officer, tackling him to ground as the first harvester leaped from the ceiling. But Miller didn't run. He stood his ground as a harvester lunged at him. As the creature's claw pierced his chest, Miller didn't bleed red. He bled sapphire blue. The residual energy from the Spire was still inside him, and it was toxic to the Warden's biology. The harvester shrieked, its form beginning to crystallize and shatter as the lunar energy surged through it. The Spire wasn't just a shield, Miller realized, his voice echoing through the entire complex. It was a poison, a failsafe. If the Warden ever tried to activate the selection without the Moon's permission, the Spire was designed to overload the system. The red lights of the chamber began to flicker. The deep metallic groaning of the ocean returned, but this time it was coming from the Warden itself. The entire inverted pyramid began to vibrate, its internal systems clashing with the blue virus Miller had brought back in his blood. "The vault is cracking," Thorne yelled, grabbing a fallen piece of spire glass to use as a weapon. If the Warden fails, the pressure will crush everything in this trench. Outside the translucent walls, the glowing eye of the Warden, the deep red light they had seen during splashdown, began to bleed blue. The clash of the two alien philosophies, the lunar shield and the abyssal vault, was tearing the Mariana Trench apart, and above them, invisible through the miles of water but felt in the very marrow of their bones, the first scouts of the swarm had entered the atmosphere. The no trespassing sign was gone, and the dinner bell was ringing. The vibration of the Mariana Trench was no longer mechanical hum. It had transformed into a tectonic scream. As the sapphire lunar energy from Miller's blood collided with the Warden's crimson abyssal circuitry, the foundations of the underwater fortress began to liquefy. The black glass floor beneath Thorne and Volkov rippled like water, turning from a solid anchor into a treacherous, shifting trap. The pressure field, once a stable pocket of safety, began to flicker, and the weight of the Pacific Ocean groaned against the failing barriers. "The integrity is gone," Volkov roared, his voice nearly drowned out by the sound of metal shearing. "If that field collapses, we won't even have time to feel our bones turn to dust." But the threat from the depths was suddenly eclipsed by a terror descending from above. Through the translucent obsidian ceiling of the chamber, miles of dark ocean water began to boil with sickly chemical heat. Debris began to rain down to the abyss. Not the clean geometric shards of the spire, but massive organic pods that pulsed with pale, bioluminescent yellow. The swarm had arrived. Their first act of occupation was not a diplomatic landing, but a biological bombardment of the Earth's oceans, designed to suffocate the native ecosystem and replace it with their own suffocating biomass. The Navy officer, his face now half crystallized by the sapphire infection, crawled toward the central pedestal with a desperate, frantic strength. "You fools!" he shrieked, his voice breaking into a digital resonance. The Warden was the only thing hiding our heat signatures from the heavens. Without the deep descent, we are just a beacon in the dark. You haven't saved the world. Yunvi just rung the dinner bell. Thorne lunged for the officer, wresting a metallic cylinder from the man's grip, a data core that flickered with a frantic red light of the Warden's primary processor. As the connection severed, the remnant soldiers, those half-integrated humans who had served the machine for decades, collapsed simultaneously. Their link to the collector was broken, and years of suppressed human memory flooded back into their hijacked minds with such violence that they could only scream. Miller stood in the center of the collapsing vault, his body glowing with a blinding intensity. He was no longer a man. He was a conduit for two clashing alien philosophies. "The Warden isn't a vault, Thorne," Miller said, his voice echoing to the very water beyond the walls. "It's a cocoon," and the spire was the only thing keeping it from hatching. The resolution of the Warden's true purpose was more horrific than any harvest. As the red and blue energies reached a terminal frequency, the inverted pyramid didn't shatter. It began to unfold like a monstrous metallic flower. The black glass plate slid apart, revealing not a machine, but a biological entity that had been gestating in the Earth's mantle for eons. It was a gargantuan, translucent titan with miles-long tentacles that began to lash out, reaching upward toward the surface, toward the swarm. The Warden was never meant to protect us, Thorne realized, watching the entity begin its violent ascent. It was meant to fight them. The Earth is a battleground between two predators, and we are just the insects caught between their feet. As the Warden entity rose, it created a massive upward current, a displacement of water so great it threatened to swallow the entire trench. The landing module, though battered and partially fused with alien biomass, was caught in the upward surge. "Alexei, the module, if we can get inside, the wake of that thing might carry us to the surface." Thorne shouted, dragging the dazed and glowing Miller toward the open hatch. They barely cleared the docking bay. As the hatch slammed shut and Volkov activated the emergency buoyancy thrusters, the Mariana Trench imploded behind them. The Warden entity had fully detached from the crust, leaving a gaping wound in the Earth's mantle that began to drain the ocean into the fires of the core. The journey up was a nightmare of crushing G-forces and bioluminescent fire. Outside the porthole, they saw the Warden's tentacles entangling with the swarm's seeding pods in a display of primal, cosmic violence. The ocean had become a graveyard of colossal, clashing titans. When the Vostok Alpha finally breached the waves, there was no sun to greet them. The sky had been replaced by a web of silver filaments, a Dyson net being woven by the swarm to trap the Earth's heat and strip the atmosphere. The horizon was a jagged line of fire where the swarmed harvesters were already beginning to consume the ozone layer. But even more shocking was a vessel waiting for them, bobbing silently in the churning water just 100 yards away. It wasn't American or Soviet. It was a 1940s-era German U-boat, but its hull was coated in the same sapphire glass as the Lunar Spire. The hatch of the U-boat opened, and a man in a tattered lead-line flight suit stepped out. He wasn't a ghost. He was a German officer they had seen mummified on the moon, but here he was young, vibrant, and his eyes were clear. "Commander Miller," the German called out, his voice carrying over the roaring wind of the dying world. "The Sentinel is dead, and the Warden is loose. The history you were taught is a scorched page. If you want to save what remains of the human seed, you have to go back to the source." "And where is that?" Thorne demanded, looking at the burning sky and the silver net above. 1944, Miller whispered, looking at the U-boat with a terrifying recognition. "The year the first signal was sent. We have to kill the project before it ever reaches the moon. We have to delete ourselves from the timeline." Miller stepped onto the edge of the module, the silver light in his eyes reflecting the fire in the sky. The 1950s were gone. The Cold War was a memory. The only thing left was a war for a time that no longer existed. The hatch slammed shut, and the roar of the dying 1950s world vanished. The interior of the submarine was a masterpiece of impossible engineering. Brass valves and iron pipes were woven together with pulsing blue conduits that looked like the nervous system of a god. The German officer, who introduced himself only as Hauptmann Richter, stood by the periscope. He didn't look like an enemy. He looked like a man who had been watching the end of the world on a loop for 1,000 years. "Welcome to the Ethelgard," Richter said, his voice echoing in the cramped, glowing space. "You think you've traveled miles to get here. You haven't. You've traveled through the cracks in the foundation of reality. We are currently submerged in the year 1944, but we are anchored to the coordinates of your failure in 1958. Thorne gripped the edge of the chart table, his head spinning. "The signal we found on the moon, the one that started the space race. You're saying you sent it?" "We didn't send a signal," Richter replied, turning to face them. His eyes were not sapphire or red. They were a hollow, translucent gray. "We sent a warning. We found the Spire buried in the Alps during the heights of the war. We thought it was a weapon. We thought it was the wonder waft that would win the war for the Reich. We were wrong. It was a beacon. The moment we touched it, we alerted the swarm. We didn't start a war between nations. We started the countdown for the extinction of the species." Suddenly, the submarine lurched. A sound like 1,000 screaming violins tore through the hull. Volkov lunged for his holster, but the weapon was gone, dissolved into the very air of the boat. Outside the portholes, the ocean was gone. They were moving through a kaleidoscope of overlapping eras. Thorne saw the burning skyline of London in 1940, followed by a fleeting glimpse of a futuristic city being devoured by silver filaments. "The timeline is hemorrhaging," Miller whispered, his silver eyes fixed on the depth gauge. The needle wasn't measuring water pressure. It was measuring years. It was spinning backward, past 1950, past 1948. By killing the Spire's memory in 1958, Thorne, you didn't just stop the machine. You created a temporal vacuum. The universe is trying to heal the wound by erasing everything that happened between the first signal and the final impact. Richter nodded grimly. "And that includes us. If we don't reach the Alps in 1944 before the Spire is fully activated, we will be erased along with the rest of the 20th century. We are the anomalies, the debris of a broken history." The uncertainty of their existence became a physical pain. Thorne looked at his hands. They were becoming translucent, the bones visible through the skin like X-ray film. Volkov was coughing up gray dust, his very atoms struggling to remain bonded in a time where he hadn't yet been born. "The Alpine facility," Thorne gasped, fighting the urge to vanish. "How do we stop it? If we destroy the Spire in 44, the swarm still heard the first signal. They're still coming." "We don't destroy it," Richter said, pulling a lever that sent the submarine into a steep, chronological dive. We changed the frequency. The spire was a shield, but it was set to the wrong resonance. It was acting as a lighthouse for the swarm, because it was tuned to human fear. We have to tune it to something else, something they can't see. And what is that? Volkov asked, clutching a brass rail. Silence, Richter said. Absolute mathematical silence. But to broadcast silence, we need a mind that has already been hollowed out by the void. We need a pilot who has touched the edge of the galaxy and returned. They all looked at Miller. The man who was once a simple test pilot was now a shivering mass of sapphire light. He looked at Thorne, and for the first time, Thorne saw a flicker of the old Jack Miller, the man who loved fast planes and cold beer. I can do it, Miller whispered. But Thorne, if I broadcast the silence, I won't just be the pilot. I'll be the signal. I'll be the thing that never happened. You'll wake up in a 1958 where the moon is just a rock, where there is no Project Iron Vein, and where I never existed. The weight of the sacrifice hung in the air, heavier than the pressure of the deep. If they succeeded, the world would be saved from the swarm and the Warden. But the brotherhood they had forged in the lunar dark would be wiped from the ledger of time. They would be strangers in a world that didn't know it had been saved. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the Ethelgard. The sapphire hull cracked, and instead of water, a flood of silver filaments began to pour into the cabin. The swarm wasn't just in the sky of the 1950s. They were hunting through the timelines. They had found the submarine. They're here! Volkov screamed, swinging a heavy wrench at the encroaching silver webs. The filaments moved like liquid mercury, seeking out the warmth of their bodies. We're at the coordinates. Richter shouted, pointing to a hatch in the floor. The Alpine vault is directly beneath us. Go, now, before the paradox consumes the boat. Thorne grabbed Miller's arm, but as he did, he felt a cold, sharp sensation in his chest. He looked down. A silver filament had pierced his suit, and it was rapidly turning his blood into lead. Go, Thorne, Miller said, his voice echoing with newfound strength. He placed a hand on Thorne's chest, and the sapphire light surged, burning away the silver infection. I'll hold the door. You find the core. You give me the silence. As Thorne and Volkov dropped through the hatch into the dark, frozen tunnels of the 1944 Nazi facility, the last thing they saw was Miller standing in the middle of the flooding submarine, surrounded by silver shadows, his eyes burning with the light of a star that was about to go out. The tunnels were cold, smelling of wet concrete and desperation. In the distance, they could hear the rhythmic clanking of heavy boots and the barking of German orders. But beneath the sounds of war, there was a deeper, more terrifying sound. The spire was waking up, and it was hungry. The transition from the temporal wake of the Ethelgard into the concrete bowels of the Alpine vault was a brutal assault on the senses. Thorne and Volkov tumbled onto a floor of cold, damp stone, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and the ozone of a technology that shouldn't exist in 1944. Above them, the ceiling pulsed with a rhythmic, dull thud, the sound of Allied bombers hammering the mountain above, blissfully unaware that the fate of the human species was being decided in the shadows beneath the rock. Check your vitals, Volkov hissed, pressing his back against a dripping concrete pillar. He looked at his hands. They were no longer translucent, but they were shaking. The temporal instability had passed, replaced by the grim reality of a subterranean war zone. Thorne checked the data core he had brought from the Warden's vault. It was humming, its red light clashing with the dim, flickering electric bulbs of the Nazi facility. The signal is coming from the lower level. If Richter was right, the spire in this era is still in its learning phase. It's absorbing the ambient psychic noise of the war, the fear, the hatred, the death. That's why the swarm found us. We're broadcasting a cosmic scream. They moved through the corridors with the silent precision of ghosts. The facility was a nightmare of industrial Gothic architecture. Heavy iron gears, humming vacuum tubes, and rows of lead-shielded monitors. But as they reached the observation gallery overlooking the central chamber, they stopped. Below them, the spire was not the sleek, obsidian tower they had seen on the moon. Here, in 1944, it was a raw, jagged shard of black glass, half encased in a scaffold of German steel. Standing at the base of the shard was a man Thorne recognized from the classified files of Project Blue Book. It was a younger Elias Thorne, his own father. "My God," Thorne whispered, his heart stopping. He wasn't just a colonel. He was the one who found it. He's the one who initiated the first contact. Beside the elder Thorne was a group of SS scientists, their faces obscured by heavy gas masks. They were adjusting a series of massive copper coils that surrounded the spire. The air around the glass was distorted, shimmering with a heat that didn't belong in a frozen mountain. "They're trying to jumpstart the engine," Volkov whispered, his hand hovering over an empty holster. "If they hit that shard with enough voltage, the frequency will lock. It will become a permanent beacon." The uncertainty of the moment was a suffocating shroud. If Thorne intervened and killed his father, he might stop the spire, but he would also erase his own existence before he could complete the mission. If he waited, the beacon would ignite, and the 1950s nightmare they had just escaped would become the inevitable future. Suddenly, a voice crackled in Thorne's earpiece, a ghost signal from the submarine trapped in the temporal fold. It was Miller. "Thorne, the silver is everywhere. I can't hold the bridge much longer. You have to insert the core now. Don't worry about the man. Worry about the machine. He's my father, Jack." Thorne yelled into the comms, but there was only static. Below, the younger Elias Thorne stepped toward the spire. He held a primitive, handheld sensor that was vibrating with a sapphire light. He looked mesmerized, his eyes reflecting the deep, cold void of the black glass. He reached out to touch the surface, his hand trembling with a mixture of scientific curiosity and primal dread. He doesn't know, Thorne realized. He thinks he's discovering the future of energy. He doesn't know he's opening the door for the locusts. "We have company," Volkov warned, pointing toward the far end of the gallery. A squad of SS guards had spotted them. They didn't ask for passwords. They opened fire with MP40s. The bullets sparked against the concrete pillars, the sound echoing like thunder in the vaulted chamber. Thorne and Volkov scrambled for cover, the reality of 1944 finally catching up to them. "I'll hold them off," Volkov shouted, grabbing a discarded iron bar and a heavy wrench. "Get to the core. Change the frequency." Thorne didn't hesitate. He leaped from the gallery, sliding down a series of metal cooling pipes until he hit the floor of the central chamber. The scientists scattered, screaming in German as an intruder crashed into their workspace. Elias Thorne spun around, his eyes wide with shock as he looked at a man who bore his own face, aged by a war that hadn't happened yet. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, reaching for a Luger at his hip. "I'm the man you're about to become if you touch that thing," Thorne shouted, lunging at his father. They collided in front of the pulsing shard. The physical contact sent a jolt of temporal energy through both of them. Thorne felt his memories of 1958 blurring. The moon, the Pacific, the Warden, all of it began to feel like a dream he was forgetting as he woke up. Thorne managed to pin his father to the floor. The data core from the Warden held high. The spire reacted to the red light of the core, its black surface turning a violent, angry crimson. The copper coils began to melt, the heat in the room becoming unbearable. "You're killing us all," Elias screamed, struggling under his son's weight. "I'm saving you from a fate worse than death," Thorne replied. He jammed the Warden's core into a primary interface port at the base of the spire. The reaction was instantaneous. The red light of the Warden and the blue light of the spire didn't clash this time. They merged. The frequency shifted from a scream to a low, mathematical hum. The silence Miller had spoken began to radiate from the mountain. Outside, in the sky of 1944, the silver filaments that had begun to manifest in the clouds suddenly dissolved. The swarm, deprived of their lighthouse, lost the coordinates for the Earth. The timeline began to stabilize, but the price was immediate. The spire began to sink, not into the ground, but out of reality itself. It was withdrawing into the fold, taking the Warden's core with it. "It's working," Thorne yelled, but as he looked up, he saw Volkov at the edge of the gallery, surrounded by guards. Volkov gave a grim nod, his form beginning to flicker as the timeline corrected itself. He wasn't supposed to be here. None of them were. Suddenly, the spire emitted a final, blinding pulse of white light. Thorne felt himself being pulled toward the glass, his atoms unraveling. He looked at his father one last time. Elias was no longer fighting. He was staring at the shard with a look of profound, empty peace. "Remember the silence, Dad," Thorne whispered. The world went white. When the light faded, Thorne found himself standing on a snowy hillside. The Alpine vault was gone. There was no concrete, no steel, and no spire. It was just a quiet, winter morning in 1944. He looked down at his hands. They were solid. He looked at his clothes. He was wearing a tattered U.S. Army winter jacket. He walked toward the nearby road, where a column of American tanks was rumbling toward the front lines. He felt a strange, hollow sensation in his mind, a memory of a moon that screamed and an ocean that boiled, but the details were slipping away like smoke. He reached into his pocket and felt something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. It was Miller's dog tags. But as he looked at them, the name on the metal began to fade, replaced by a series of coordinates he didn't recognize. And in the distance, far above the clouds where stars should be, he saw a single, faint flash of sapphire light. The silence had been broadcast, but someone was still listening. Thorne stood by the side of the slushy Alpine road, the rumble of the M4 Sherman tanks vibrating through his boots. To the soldiers passing by, he was just another weary infantryman separated from his unit in the chaos of the Ardennes. They didn't see the man who had witnessed the moon crack open. They didn't see the survivor of a 1958 that had been erased from the ledger of existence. He gripped the dog tags in his pocket. The metal was unnervingly warm. The name Jack Miller was gone, replaced by a string of numbers etched with precision that number 1944 stamping machine could achieve. He knew those coordinates. They weren't in the Alps, and they weren't in the Pacific. They pointed to a desolate patch of the New Mexico desert, a place the world would later know as Roswell. The silence he had broadcast was supposed to be a cloak, a mathematical void that would make Earth invisible to the swarm. But as Thorne looked up at the pale morning moon, he realized the sky looked wrong. The stars were too bright, and there was a faint, shimmering distortion at the edge of his vision, like oil on water. The timeline hadn't been fixed. It had been cauterized. "Hey, Mac, you hit in the head or something?" A sergeant barked from the turret of a passing tank. "The Krauts are retreating, but they ain't gone yet. Get moving." Thorne didn't move. He couldn't, because as the tank rumbled past, the shadow it cast on the snow didn't match the vehicle. For a split second, the shadow was jagged, multi-limbed, and made of shifting obsidian geometry. The silence hadn't just hidden Earth from the swarm. It had trapped a fragment of the lunar nightmare here in 1944. He began to walk, not toward the front lines, but away from them, following the pull of the dog tags. He walked until the sound of the tanks faded, replaced by the whistling wind of the high passes. He reached a small stone hut, a shepherd's refuge that looked centuries old. Standing outside, smoking a cigarette that smelled of sulfur and ozone, was Major Alexei Volkov. Volkov looked different. His Soviet uniform was gone, replaced by the dark, heavy coat of a partisan. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was staring at a compass that was spinning in useless circles. "You're late, Thorne," Volkov said, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't look surprised to see a man who shouldn't exist. "I woke up in a ditch 3 miles back. My memories are leaking. I remember the Vostok Alpha, but I also remember dying in a gulag in 1941. Which one is real?" "Both," Thorne said, stepping into the cold shadow of the hut. "And neither. We've created a paradox. Alexei, we changed the past, but we didn't delete the trauma. The universe is trying to reconcile two versions of history, and we're the stitches holding them together. Where is Miller?" Volkov asked, his eyes searching the empty peaks. Thorne pulled out the dog tags. "He's a signal now. He's out there, somewhere in the static between seconds. But he left us these coordinates. Roswell, 1947. The uncertainty of their mission intensified. If the Spire had been removed from the Alps in 1944, why were the coordinates leading them to the most famous crash site in history? The answer came from the data core Thorne was still carrying, the red device from the Warden's vault. It wasn't dead. It was pulsing with a low, rhythmic heartbeat. The Warden didn't die when the entity hatched. Thorne whispered, looking at the glowing device. It didn't fight the swarm to save us. It fought the swarm to protect its investment. The coordinates aren't a map to a crash. They're a map to a landing. Suddenly, the ground beneath the hut vibrated. It wasn't an earthquake, and it wasn't a bomb. It was a localized gravitational shift. Outside, the snow began to fall upward. A figure emerged from the whiteout. It moved with a stuttering, nonlinear motion, appearing and disappearing every few feet. It was a German officer, Richter, but his body was a patchwork of different eras. One arm was encased in the sapphire glass of the spire. The other was a withered limb of the mummy they had seen on the moon. The broadcast failed, Richter said, his voice a chorus of overlapping frequencies. The swarm didn't lose us. They just changed their sensors. They are no longer looking for our fear. They are looking for the silence itself. By broadcasting a void, you create a hole in the universe that they can see from across the galaxy. Then what do? Volkov demanded, reaching for a knife he no longer had. We finished the circuit, Richter said, pointing to the dog tags. The coordinates in New Mexico aren't for 1947. They are for right now. The Warden sent a backup vessel through the temporal rift before the spire collapsed. It's sitting in the desert, waiting for the core. The resolution was a bitter pill. To truly hide the Earth, they couldn't just be silent. They had to become a part of the swarm's own network. They had to use the Warden's backup vessel to infiltrate the silver filaments and rewrite the swarm's biological command code from the inside. It's a suicide mission, Thorne said, looking at the gray, dying officer. It's a legacy, Richter replied. You are Eldermurk, Thorne, the Watchers in the Dark. You were born in the 1950s, forged in the lunar void, and now you must die in the 1940s to ensure there's a future at all. As Richter spoke, the sky above the Alps began to tear. The silver filaments appeared, but they weren't weaving a net this time. They were forming a spear, aimed directly at the stone hut. The swarm had found the hole in the silence. The core, Thorne, Volkov shouted, pointing to the glowing red cylinder. If that thing hits us, the core becomes theirs. Thorne looked at the coordinates on Miller's tags. He felt a sudden, sharp pull in his chest. The sapphire infection wasn't gone. It was just dormant. He realized he didn't need a ship to get to New Mexico. The paradox was a ship. Alexei grabbed my hand. Thorne yelled. As the silver spear of the swarm pierced the roof of the hut, Thorne slammed the Warden's core against the sapphire dog tags. The clashing of the red and blue energies created a localized collapse of space-time. The stone hut vanished. The Alps vanished. Thorne and Volkov were no longer in the snow. They were standing in a field of desert scrub under a scorching New Mexico sun. The heat was a physical blow after the alpine winter, but as they looked toward the horizon, they didn't see a crash saucer. They saw a massive silver tower rising from the sand, identical to the one they had destroyed on the moon. Only this one wasn't black. It was white, and it was already surrounded by U.S. Army trucks with 1947 markings. We're too late, Volkov whispered, shielding his eyes from the glare. They've already started the reverse engineering. Standing by the lead truck, looking at the silver tower with a predatory grin, was a man who looked exactly like Dr. Eris Thorne, the linguist who had died in the lunar engine. But this Eris was wearing a black suit and holding a briefcase marked with a single word: majestic. The war hadn't ended. It had just changed its name. The heat of the New Mexico desert in 1947 was a different kind of violence than the freezing vacuum of the moon. It was a dry, suffocating weight that carried the scent of sagebrush and heated metal. Thorne and Volkov stood at the edge of the exclusion zone, their 1944 Alpine gear making them look like ghosts of a war that hadn't quite ended. A few hundred yards away, the silver tower, the white spire, shimmered in the desert haze. It wasn't buried or broken. It was perfectly vertical, a surgical needle of non-reflective alloy piercing the sand. This was the backup Richter had spoken of, the Warden's fail-safe sent to the temporal tear. But the mystery was no longer about where it came from. It was about who was already there. That's him, Thorne hissed, pulling Volkov behind a ridge of red rock. He pointed toward the man in the black suit. That's my uncle. Eris Thorne, but in the timeline we left, he was a linguist who died in the lunar engine. Here, he looks like he owns a world. Eris was walking among the U.S. Army officers with an unnerving calm. He wasn't studying the tower with the wonder of a scientist. He was giving orders as its master. Around the base of the spire, soldiers were unloading lead line crates, but they weren't taking things out. They were putting things in. They aren't reverse engineering it, Thorne, Volkov whispered, squinting through the glare. Look at the cables. They're feeding it. They're giving the tower a jump start using terrestrial power grids. Thorne looked at the Warden's red data core in his hand. It was vibrating so hard it was nearly glowing. The white spire wasn't just a tower. It was a hungry mouth. If Eris and his majestic group fed enough energy, it wouldn't just broadcast a signal. It would create a permanent gateway for the swarm, decades before the world was ready to even conceptualize the threat. The uncertainty of their next move was a razor's edge. They needed to reach the tower to insert the core and trigger the final silence. But they were 2 men against a military battalion and a shadow government that already seemed to know they were coming. We need a distraction, Thorne said. Distraction is my specialty, Volkov replied, his eyes narrowing. He looked at a nearby fuel truck. But Thorne, if your uncle is running this, he knows the frequency of your sapphire infection. He'll see you coming a mile away. Then I won't go in as a ghost, Thorne said. He took off his tattered 1944 jacket and wiped the desert grime from his face. I'll go in as a nephew. Thorne walked out from the ridge, his hands raised. He didn't run. He walked with the confidence of a man who belonged there. Within seconds, a dozen M1 Garens were leveled at his chest. Hold your fire. Eris Thorne's voice cut through the desert air. He stepped away from the generals, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied. Well, the prodigal traveler returns from a moon that never was. Welcome to 1947, Elias. Or should I call you by the name you'll take in 10 years? You're killing us all, Eris, Thorne said, his voice steady despite the guns. The swarm is already watching the hole we made in the Alps. If you activate that tower, you're not gaining power. You're giving them the keys to the house. Eris laughed, a dry, hollow sound. The swarm is an inevitability, Elias. You saw the filter in the 1950s. You saw the Warden selection. I'm just making sure our family is on the right side of the glass when the harvesting starts. Majestic isn't about covering up aliens. It's about managing the extinction. Eris stepped closer, his eyes reflecting the silver surface of the tower. Give me the core. I know you have it. It's the only piece of the 1958 logic that can stabilize the gateway. Give it to me, and I'll make sure you and Volkov are integrated into the vault. You'll live forever in the deep memory of the Warden. I've seen your forever, Eris, Thorne said. It looks a lot like a mummified German in a lunar coffin. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the perimeter. Volkov had reached the fuel truck. A wall of orange fire and black smoke billowed into the air, throwing the soldiers into a panic. Thorne didn't wait. He lunged at Eris, but the older man moved with a speed that wasn't human. Eris's hand shot out, his fingers cold as liquid nitrogen, and gripped Thorne's wrist. The sapphire light in your blood. It's beautiful, Elias, Eris whispered, his own eyes beginning to glow with a faint, hungry red. But it's just fuel for the machine. Thorne felt the energy being drained from his body. The white spire began to pulse, reacting to proximity of the sapphire-laden blood. The desert sky began to shimmer with that oily, silver distortion. The swarm was pressing against the thin fabric of 1947. But Thorne wasn't trying to pull away. He leaned in, his face inches from his uncle's. You're right about one thing, Eris, Thorne gasped, his vision blurring. It is fuel, but it's not for you. Thorne used his free hand to slam the Warden's core not into the tower, but into himself. He pressed the red cylinder against the sapphire-lit veins of his own neck. The reaction was a violent, blinding fusion. Thorne became the conduit. The red data of the Warden and the blue light of the spire met within his own nervous system, creating a third, impossible frequency. It wasn't silence, and it wasn't a scream. It was a command. The white spire didn't activate. It began to invert it. The silver metal began to fold on itself, drawing the desert sand, the trucks, and the soldiers into a localized gravitational well. No! Eris screamed, his form beginning to flicker. The sequence! You're collapsing the anchor. I'm closing the door, Eris. Thorne yelled, the power tearing his atoms apart. For good! The resolution was a terrifying erasure. The white spire vanished in a silent, white flash, taking Eris, Thorne, and the majestic project with it. The desert was left empty, save for a massive glass-lined crater. Thorne fell to sand, his body smoking, his skin a patchwork of blue and red scars. Volkov ran to his side, his face covered in soot. Is it done? Volkov asked, looking at the clear, blue New Mexico sky. Thorne looked up. The silver filaments were gone. The stars, though invisible in the daylight, felt distant and cold again. But as he looked at the dog tags in his hand, the coordinates had changed one last time. They weren't for Earth. They were for a point in deep space, millions of miles away, moving fast. We closed the door here, Thorne whispered, his voice failing. But Eris was right about one thing. The swarm is an inevitability. They're not coming for our past anymore. They're waiting for our future. In the distance, the sirens of more U.S. Army reinforcements grew louder. They were coming to investigate the Roswell incident. Thorne and Volkov knew they couldn't be found. They were the ultimate classified files, the men who didn't exist, who had saved a world that would never know it was in danger. We have to go, Alexei, Thorne said, struggling to stand. Where? Volkov asked. There's nowhere left to run in this century. Thorne looked at the center of the crater. A small, sapphire-colored spark was still hovering there, a remnant of collapse. A tiny, unstable doorway. To the only place they can't follow, Thorne said. Into the Eldermurk. The sapphire spark at the center of the Roswell crater was not a door. It was a wound. As Thorne and Volkov stepped into shimmering distortion, the heat of the New Mexico desert was replaced by a cold so absolute it felt like a physical assault on their souls. They were no longer in 1947, and they were no longer on Earth. They were drifting in the Eldermurk, the non-space between timelines, a graveyard of lost realities where the swarm stored the remnants of the civilizations they had already consumed. Around them, the Eldermurk revealed its true, horrific nature. It was a vast, infinite cathedral of black glass and silver filaments. Floating in the void were fragments of different worlds. A piece of a futuristic London with spire-top gardens, a section of Martian colony carved from red rock, and a Victorian-era steamship frozen in a block of sapphire ice. Each fragment was a seed that had been harvested by the spire throughout history. We aren't in a portal, Thorne, Volkov whispered, his breath hitching as he saw his own reflection in a passing shard of glass. His reflection wasn't him. It was a version of him wearing a general's uniform, standing over a ruined Moscow. We're in the archive. This is where they keep the patterns before they rewrite the universe. Thorne looked at his own hands. The sapphire light and the red Warden energy were no longer fighting. They had merged into a stable, violet glow that pulsed in sync with the archive itself. He was the key that Eris Thorne had tried to turn. He was the only thing in this void that still possessed a living human will. The coordinates on the tags, Thorne said, pulling Miller's dog tags from his pocket. They were vibrating with a frantic intensity. They aren't pointing to a place. They're pointing to a frequency. Miller isn't dead. Alexei, he's a lighthouse. As they moved deeper into the archive, the silver filaments began to coalesce into shapes. They weren't the jagged harvesters of the moon or the biological titans of the Pacific. These were figures made of pure light and data. They were the ancestors, the original architects of the Spire and the Warden, a race that had long ago uploaded their consciousness into a swarm to escape their own extinction. You returned the core to the silence. A chorus of voices echoed inside Thorne's mind, bypassing his ears entirely. It was a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering at once. But the silence is a vacuum. A vacuum must be filled. You have deleted your history, Elias Thorne. You have saved a world that no longer remembers your name. But by doing so, you have left the door open for the return. The return, Thorne demanded, standing his ground as the light figures surrounded them. The swarm does not destroy, it optimizes. We are the perfection of the biological struggle. We are the end of the war you call life. By disrupting the 1950s harvest, you have delayed the inevitable, but you have also alerted the core. The great filter is no longer a cycle. It is now a hunt. Suddenly, the archive began to shake. The fragments of lost worlds started to collide, grinding together with a sound that could be felt in the marrow of their bones. In the distance, a massive, geometric shadow began to emerge from the violet fog. It was a Mother Spire, the source of every iron vein in the galaxy. Miller! Thorne screamed, the violet light in his veins flaring. If you can hear me, give us the path. We can't stay here. From the heart of the Mother Spire, a single beam of pure white light erupted. It cut through the silver filaments, and the light figures like a blade. Inside the beam, Thorne saw a silhouette. It was Jack Miller, but he was no longer human. He had become a giant, his form composed of silence they had broadcast from the Alps. He was the barrier between the archive and the earth. Thorne, Volkov. Miller's voice was a thunderous rumble that shook the void. I can't hold them forever. The swarm is adapting. They are rewriting their code to bypass the silence. There is only one way to truly close the door. Tell us. Volkov shouted, his body beginning to dissolve into the violet fog. You have to destroy the archive from the inside. You have to trigger a total systemic collapse of the Eldermurk. If this place dies, every seed they've ever stolen will be returned to its own time, but the swarm will be locked out of our reality for eternity. And what happens to us? Thorne asked, knowing the answer before it was spoken. We become the foundation of the new world, Miller said. We stay in the dark, so the light can stay on for them. We are the Eldermurk. We are the price. Thorne looked at Volkov. The Russian major looked at the fragment of ruined Moscow floating nearby, then back at Thorne. He gave a grim, tired smile. I've died 12 times in 12 different years, Thorne. I think I'm ready for the one that actually matters. Thorne nodded. He took the Warden's data core and held it high. The violet light in his body began to surge, connecting with the Mother Spire. He felt the weight of every lost civilization, every stolen memory, and every erased life. But as he prepared to trigger the collapse, the silver filaments did something unexpected. They didn't attack. They began to take a new shape, a shape that looked exactly like the New Mexico desert in 1947. It's a trap, Thorne whispered. They're trying to simulate a reality where we won. They want us to walk into a dream, so they can keep the archive. Inside the simulation, Thorne saw his father, Elias, and his uncle, Elias, standing together. They were waving to him. It looked perfect. It looked like peace. Don't look at it, Alexei! Thorne yelled. It's not real. He closed his eyes and focused on the weight of the dog tags. He focused on the cold, hard truth of the vacuum. He began to chant the mathematical sequence of the silence, the code that Miller had died to broadcast. The archive began to scream. The white light of the Mother Spire turned into a blinding supernova. The Eldermurk was collapsing. The archive of the unborn did not go quietly. As Thorne chanted the sequence of the absolute silence, the Eldermurk convulsed. The simulated reality of the 1947 desert, the false peace offered by the swarm, began to tear like wet paper. Behind the holographic faces of his father and uncle, Thorne saw the true face of the enemy, a mindless, infinite lattice of silver light that cared nothing for human emotion, only for the cold efficiency of the harvest. Hold on to the frequency, Alexei! Thorne screamed over the roar of collapsing dimensions. Volkov wasn't screaming. He was standing perfectly still, his body now a translucent pillar of violet energy. He had stopped fighting the dissolution. He had become a part of it. It's beautiful, Thorne, the major whispered, his voice sounding like the chime of a distant bell. I can see them. All of them. Every soldier who died in the snow, every pilot who burned in the atmosphere. They're waking up. The Mother Spire at the center of the archive began to invert. The gravity did not just pull, it erased. Every stolen fragment of history, the futuristic cities, the ancient ships, the erased lives, was being ejected from the Eldermurk. They were being flung back into the stream of time, returning to their rightful places like blood returning to a heart. But for every world saved, the archive demanded a permanent void. The swarm's command structure was shattering. Without the Eldermurk to store their data, the silver filaments began to wither and turn to gray ash. The great filter was being dismantled from the inside out. Thorne felt the Warden's data core in his hand begin to melt. The red heat and the sapphire light were now one single, blinding white fire. He looked toward the heart of the Mother Spire and saw Jack Miller. Miller wasn't a man anymore. He was a colossus of pure logic, holding back the weight of the entire swarm collective with his bare hands. "Elias, it is time," Miller's voice echoed, not in Thorne's mind, but in his very soul. "The door is closing. If you stay, you will be the guardian of the vacuum. You will be the Eldermurk. You will watch over the timeline to ensure they never return. But you can never go home." Thorne looked back at the fading image of Earth, a blue marble beginning to glow with a new, untainted light. He saw 1958, where the moon was just a silent, cratered rock. He saw a world where the Cold War was just a struggle between men, not a race for alien scraps. It was a world that would never know his name. A world that would never know he had saved it. "I was never home in that world anyway," Thorne said, a grim, final smile crossing his face. He stepped into the center of the Mother Spire. The explosion was silent. It was a total erasure of the Eldermurk. In a single, infinite second, the archive vanished. The silver filaments dissolved into the cosmic background radiation. The swarm was not destroyed, but was blinded, severed from the Earth's frequency for eternity. On Earth. In the year 1958, a young astronomer at an observatory in New Mexico looked through his telescope. He expected to see the faint blue glow that had been bothering the scientific community for weeks. But there was nothing. The moon was gray. The stars were steady. He blinked, checked his lenses, and sighed. "Just a glitch in the atmosphere," he muttered, closing his notebook. But deep in the Eldermurk, the layer of reality that sits beneath the stars and behind the shadows, 3 figures remained: Thorne, Volkov, and Miller. They sat in the cockpit of a phantom Vostok Alpha, drifting to the violet mist of a timeline that no longer needed them. They were the Watchers. They were the secret. They were the iron veins that held the world together from the dark. The files are closed. The moon is silent. But the shadows still move in the corners of your vision, and the static on your radio still hums with the remnants of a war fought before you were born. History is not what you were told. It is a garden grown over a graveyard. If you have the courage to look deeper into the files of the unknown, to peer behind the curtain of the Cold War and into the abyss of the cosmic truth, then stay vigilant. Subscribe to Eldermurk, like this transmission, to keep the signal alive. Because the silence is our only shield, and we are the ones who watch the dark. The mission is complete. The timeline is safe. But remember, we are still out here, waiting.